Today we're taking a Figma design and turn that into a React site using Codux. Now think of Codux like Xcode, but for web designers. In this course, we'll start with a simple design and build a responsive site from scratch using code export from Figma. We'll begin with basic HTML, then set up boards and components, master Figma to CSS techniques, work with variables and media queries, create multiple pages, optimize for SEO, and then we'll publish the site on the web using GitHub and Netlify. It's going to be a lot of fun, and by the end, you'll be ready to create amazing web projects in a real environment and learn how to collaborate with developers. So the Figma design is provided, and this is all responsive, meaning that it's using auto layout with wrapping, and then all the structure has been done properly to prepare the design for code. Now, Figma to Code has become incredibly popular over the years, especially with more accuracy and with new plugins in the market. One that I'm using a lot is called Locofy, and this allows you to export full React code and CSS as well as variables. Many designers use variables, so you're going to be able to export all of those variables to quickly use for light mode and dark mode, but also to have more consistency. So you're going to be able to see how I set up everything. It is especially important to use auto layout everywhere, and then use min and max, as well as auto layout wrap. Once you set up things properly, it's going to be fully responsive. And most importantly, when you export to code, it's going to make a lot more sense. Now in Codux, you're going to see all of your components visually. This is awesome because for designers, it's going to be a lot less intimidating. You're going to be able to preview how your design works and style everything using a visual editor. Now the awesome part is that all of this is using a real React project, which means that developers can set up all the complex code for you, and you can focus on the styling, whether you want to touch CSS or not. And when you make mistakes, it's a lot more forgiving. You can also commit your code, and developers will be able to review your changes, just like in a Figma experience. So the website itself is fully responsive. It works in light and dark mode. You also have a drawer menu. You can link to multiple pages, and it has some basic appear animation using just a few lines of CSS code, and all the forms and interactions are done using real techniques. So we're gonna set React router, variables for text size, so you can easily switch between mobile and desktop sizes, but also dark mode variables, so you only need to edit the variables once to make the dark mode work. Now this course is free thanks to Codux sponsorship, and while we learn about Codux as a tool, we're still going to learn really important techniques for web development, and we're going to be working on a real React site. As a designer who works regularly with Xcode and Figma, I'm really excited about visual editors, especially for the web, because traditionally we're used to using VS Code and really focus on the coding aspect and not a visual experience like in Figma. So while it's daunting to learn a new tool, I think it's important to connect the dots for Figma designers. So you have a simple layers list on the left where you have your HTML tags, and then in the right, you're going to have your CSS styles where you can edit all the layout properties. So Codux is a downloadable application, which means that it supports Windows, Mac, and Linux. And in the background, you have the full code, which is familiar for anyone who has done React sites. You have the CSS using CSS modules. And if you're a designer who code, you can use a tool like VS Code or Z, where you have AI GitHub Copilot, where you can ask it to change the code for you. The Figma file is provided along with the assets and the code, so you can follow along without having to export the code and the assets yourself. But for those who want to learn about that experience, I will explain the workflow that I use to create the website. This is a really exciting time for designers because we can all learn to be so much more efficient using AI tools, Figma plugins, as well as amazing tools like Codux. So let's get started. To get started, I want to introduce you to the basics of using Codux as a designer or as a beginner. And we're going to learn how to build this very simple UI from scratch. We will learn how to set up a new project using some of the basic templates as well as the more advanced templates. And as we build the UI, we're going to start with the basics. So without relying on code at first, we're going to set up our styles and eventually copy HTML and CSS code from Figma. After downloading Codux, you're going to land on this screen and you might want to set up your account first. And then you will also want to play with some of the interactive tutorials so you can clone it. And it's going to install the scripts which allows you to run the virtual environment inside your computer, just like a real React project. Then you will go through some of these steps and playful playgrounds and have fun with it. You will have the layers on the left side, and you might want to get into the component to be able to edit the elements. And also, you can click on the preview to see the real website in action. Now, this is the preview mode, and we can go back to the selection mode where you can start editing the element. And just like in Figma, you can double click on elements to be able to edit them to go into the nested content. Now, you can also watch the tutorials. I think they're really helpful for anyone starting out. And then you're going to want to start a new project. I highly recommend looking at the website starter, and just like the tutorial, you're going to set your project and install the script. Now, for any website, typically you have the app template, which is the initial component that's going to be loaded on your website. And from here, it's typically going to include the header, the footer, and the main content. Now, it is important to note that what you're opening from home here is going to be the board and not the actual component. So what is a board? Well, basically, it's like a preview of your component. So think of it as in Xcode, you have your preview code and it's not really used in the real app. Well, in Codux it's the same way. This is the board and it's only used to preview each of the components. And then when you open the actual component, then you can customize how it's previewed, how the layout is responsive, and then you have your component. So you want to be able to open the component to be able to find the elements so that you can edit it. Now, typically you have your app, which is the initial element that's going to be loaded for your website, but also you have different components such as footer, header, and different pages of your app. So the app might be a bit more complex because it's going to contain some logic such as data or router. And so if you want to edit the content directly, you want to go to either the page or the header. Let's go to the page home, and then you have your board. Again, the board is here to preview your layout, and then you have your component. So the component is where you want to edit all the HTML and the styles. Another thing that is important to note is that you have the green element, which is the text itself, but then you have the container, which is where you have your style. So for example, you have your text element, you can have many text, but then you have the container that is the HTML tag, such as a P or H1 or a paragraph. And then on that container, you're going to be able to add the CSS style. And then only if you have the CSS style, you will be able to edit the CSS properties. So just like a website, you can scroll and you can also preview. You can check how it looks. You can interact with it. And also, if you want to see it from a browser, you can click on open in a new window and it's going to preview the website. So there are definitely more complex templates, including those with data and navigation, as well as animations. And then you can check and see how they're put together alongside with a preview. Now for this course, we're going to create a new project, and it's going to be from scratch. So we're going to use a blank template. So we're going to call it Codux course, and I'm going to put that in my downloads folder. And here you have the main template, which is using a very popular framework, including Vite, SCSS, and CSS modules. This allows you to use variables and more modern CSS, along with mixing variables and JavaScript to the styling. Then we're going to create a project and install the script. Now, the first thing that you're going to see is the app board. And inside the app board, if you click on it, you're going to find the app component. Again, the app board is just there to allow you to preview your component, and the component itself, it's going to be part of your final website, just like a component in Figma. And then we're going to edit this. And again, we have a super simple structure, including just 3 tags. So we have the H2, span, and paragraph. Keep in mind that it's normal that in HTML, inside a tag, you can have multiple text elements and images, as well as a BR, which is a new line, and then a B tag, which makes the text bold. Now in Figma, without getting into the code yet, typically you have your design and you want to recreate this design in Codux. So you're going to copy the text, and in Codux itself, normally your development team sets all the template and the environment for you. So you only need to work with the components and edit the styling. In our case, we're going to create from scratch so that it's easier to understand. We're going to start with the H2 tag. Now to change the text, we're going to select the text element. And here on the right side, you're going to see that you have a bunch of different properties, including the styles, the computed styles, as well as the properties. In this case, we're going to change the text content. And then if I want to change the styling, I will click on the third tab. Now here, I cannot change anything because there's no class. And the class can only be applied to the parent element. So edit parent element is going to select the H2, and this is where you can add a style. So I'm going to call this title and then create the new style. And now you can see that it's applied, and you can edit the CSS properties. In Figma, this is using a text style. And so if you open it, you're going to see directly the text size, which in this case is 50. So I'm going to set the font size to 50, and you can work with any unit that you want. Now, instead of H2, I want to set an H1. I want to have exactly the same content, and I want to show you how to insert an element. So you can go to add, or you can press A, and here you can add a bunch of elements such as a div block, a link, an image, or a video. And you can also have typography, which includes the headings as well as the paragraph. Then we have more elements, and we're going to explore them later. Now in this case, I want to use the H1, which is the main title of the website. So I'm going to insert H1. And just like in Figma, you can insert where you have selected, and you can also drag it out of the container. And so I have my H1, and I'm also going to select the text element where I'm going to go to the properties and put the text content. So now we have the H1 and then the H2, which we're going to use for the second title, and select the text element and paste that second title. And then selecting the H2 element, I'm going to remove the title class and create a new style called subtitle, and then create. Now the H2 has a 24 pixel in terms of font size, and then I'm going to move on to the paragraph. So the span itself, I'm going to delete it. Now for the paragraph, I'm also going to delete it, and then select the container, add, and this time I'm going to set a new paragraph, dragging that after H2, and then selecting the element, and I'm going to paste my text content. Now for the style, select the P, set a new class. I'm going to call it text, and then create. This is where I'm going to set a 16 pixel in terms of size. So this is pretty straightforward. You can imagine dropping into any coding project and just go straight into the styling of the HTML elements and contribute the necessary styling. which is going to ultimately save a lot of time to the team. Now, keep in mind that for a modern website, it's going to use the flex style pretty much everywhere. So for example, the container, which already has the app style, is going to have a display flex. And just like in Figma auto layout, you can set the direction horizontal or vertical. And you can also align it to the left, as well as for each element, you can align to the left. So like this. So for H1 and then for H2. Now, of course, this can mean a lot of work, especially if you have to create a new design from scratch. And this is where knowing a little bit of CSS can go a long way to helping your team. Now let's take a look at how you might want to get the CSS code directly from Figma. So if you have a pro plan, you have the dev mode, but if you don't, you're going to see the properties panel, which gives you the CSS code. In my case, I'm going to go to the dev mode, and here by default, it's going to show you the CSS code. You can also select it from the list, and you can see that this is a text element, and you have the layout code as well as the text property. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that in your code, you can use variables. So in CSS, when you see a var code, that means that it's using a dynamic property that is stored and reused throughout the design. And the same for the font property as well as the font size property. If you haven't set up your variables yet, just use the default value, such as here, the font style doesn't have a variable, so it's just going to say normal, 600, etc. And if I didn't have a variable for font size, I would just go straight to 50 pixel and then the black color. Now let's keep things simple for now and just copy the part where you don't see the variable. So from these 4 properties, we're going to save already a lot of time. So let me select the title. I already set up the font size, and then at the very bottom, you can switch to the coding part. And again, because the project is very simple, you're not going to see a lot of the complex code that are typically in a normal React site. And so you have your app.tsx, and then you have your board file. In your app.tsx is where you're going to find the component code where you have your HTML code. And so you have the div, the H1, as you might expect, just the same way that you have your layers here. They're represented perfectly in code. And that's the beauty of Codux. It's not something completely hidden from you, which makes it hard to collaborate with developers. But in this case, everything is using a real code as well as a real React environment. So for example, you can see that we're using the CSS module and we're including the CSS file, and then we have the style name, including title, subtitle, text, and then we want to edit the style for the title. In order to do this, the easiest way to edit the style is to go to the selector where you have the triple dot, click on it, and then view code. It's going to automatically open the CSS file along with highlighting the CSS code pertaining to this element, which is great. And then we're going to create a new line and paste the CSS from our Figma. And so because of this, we don't have to go and change all of these things manually. And as your design gets more and more complex, this is just the fastest way to do it. Now for the indentation, you can quickly click on the prettier formatting, and it's going to automatically set the perfect indentation for you. So this is basic CSS. As you get more familiar, you can use any technique to style whatever you want. And then we can just quickly switch to the other ones and just copy quickly one by one and get the perfect style. So I did that for the title, subtitle, and text. Now we're going to get into the buttons. And so I'm going to select the container. I'm going to add a button. And if you don't know where it is, you can just search for it. It's going to be in form, and you can click on button. Then I'm just going to move that right after the paragraph, then select on it, and I can add a new class called button. and then create. So again, if I want to edit my CSS, I'm going to click on it, and view code automatically going to jump to the CSS class, and I can just select the button and then find both the layout code and the styles. So I can just click on copy, paste the layout code, and then the style code, and voila. So yes, we do have a variable, but at the same time, we do have a default value, which is why everything is still working perfectly. And we're going to set up the variables a little bit later. Let's prettify this. And then for the text itself, notice that it's not part of the CSS property. So you need to select the text and then copy the CSS property for the button text. But typically you can put that as part of your button style because the element itself cannot be styled. And then you have the SVG, which is an image. With the button selected, I'm going to click on add, go to basic, and click on image. Here, it doesn't like that I try to insert an image inside a button. So the solution is to add an image outside, because while this is a limitation of Codux, it's not a limitation of HTML. And also we want to upload the images. So we're going to insert directly in the container, and then we're going to manage our assets. Now, as part of the assets folder, this is where we're going to import all of these images for the project. So in Codux, when you have your image element selected, you can go to the properties and then click on the image. And here often you can use a direct URL of the asset, but you can also have local assets, and we have some default ones. And also we can upload new ones and then select assets, select all the files inside the folder and click open. It's going to upload all of the images that we're going to need for this project. So I'm going to search for Figma and then insert this one. Now this logo, I will cut it and put it inside the button and add a little space, then apply prettier, and it should have the logo next to the text. So while we couldn't insert it directly into the button, you can always edit the code. It's going to still work perfectly. So this is one example where the React code and the HTML code is the real priority and not the application's graphics user interface, which is a good thing because we don't want to be limited by the visual editor. Rather, we want to be able to work on a real React site independent of Codux. And from my experience, that has been the case. So let's create the second button. And this time, let's just copy the one that we already created, then paste it right next to it. This is just basic HTML, so it shouldn't be too scary. But for the second button itself, we want to use a different style. And we're going to delete the button style and add a new style called button2, and go to Figma and copy the code. Then in Codux, we're going to edit the CSS. So for button 2, I'm going to paste that. I'm going to do the same for the style. And I'm going to repeat also for the text. And voila. Let me make it prettier. For the image, let me select it. And it's recommended to always use the property, especially for image, because it's going to have to import it first. And it's going to create the code for that. So I'm going to search for chevron, right, select on it, then close. Then I'm going to move it after the text. And also I'm going to set the button next to each other using a flex layout. The easiest way to do that is to right click on the first button and wrap that inside a div, and then drag the second button right next to the first button. Very similar to the way that you would group multiple elements inside Figma, and then select the container, and then in style, add a new one called buttons. And then we can use a flex layout, for example, set it to horizontal and the gap and all that stuff. But of course, we're going to use the code from Figma. It's going to be faster and also more accurate. So I'm going to go here, view code, and then replace all of that beautiful code, and voila, now we're ready to take care of the variables. Now let's talk about variables, because this is something that is used in most teams, And also, it's highly recommended to use it to stay consistent, and it's really effortless to create dark mode colors as well as applying styles from a UI kit or a design system. So when you go to the plugins tab, you're going to see a bunch of recommended plugins for dev mode, but also you can search for something like variable to CSS. And there are a lot of plugins out there that's going to allow you to export your variables in terms of CSS code or to different frameworks such as CSS. And so for example, I'm going to select colors and generate, and this is where I'm going to copy all of this good stuff. Now in Codux, you can see that we do have some issues with the font, and it's using a default for Manrope, but this font is not already imported. It's a Google font and it needs to be set properly. So it's really good to know that you do have the CSS module, which is specific to the component. This is great because then you only use these styles for the app component, and it's not going to conflict with another component that is using the same name, such as buttons. So CSS module is useful for that, but also you're going to need a global style where you can put your body background, your main font, your variables. So to find that, you're going to click on the plus sign right here, and this is where you can find any file from your project, including CSS. So the global file, you're going to find that inside index.css. So this is where you can apply the styling for the entire website. And especially if you're using a font family, you don't want to use that directly from the component. You want to cut this and then put that in the global file. So inside the root, I'm going to replace font family to Manrope with a variable. Now I do have the same problem for the other button. So let me remove also the font family property. And back to my index, I need to import this font from Google Fonts. Now most fonts in Figma are from Google. So we're going to search for Manrope, which is the one that we're using, click on it and click on Get Font. I'm going to get the embed code, and then for the web, I'm going to click on Import. So the style is the HTML and the CSS line is only the import line. So I'm going to copy this and go to Codux, and at the very beginning of the file, I'm going to paste that line to be able to import the custom font. So now my entire app is going to use Manrope from this point forward. So in variable to CSS, you're going to see that the generated code also includes the primitive variables. And in this case, unless you have a complex one, I'm going to ignore that and just focus on the core values. So I'm going to copy all of this code and bring that to Codux right after the first root and paste that. Once you paste variables, you're going to find that you do have the dark mode colors as well. So we're going to delete those for now and deal with dark mode a little bit later because it does add a layer of complexity. And so once you have that set up, you're going to be able to select, let's say, your title, and then go to color. And this is where you find all the variables. And in this case, I'm going to start with the foreground primary, and then you can see that it's applied here. For the H2, I'm going to use foreground secondary and the paragraph as well. So foreground secondary. Now at this point, let's create the entire container, including the image, and also let's set up our auto layout wrap similarly to how it works in Figma. It's important to understand that you should prepare your Figma file as well as you can, especially later on as we copy the entire HTML code of a component, not just element by element. It's going to take the names of the layers and containers, but for now, we can just focus on the basic techniques, such as you should always set everything to fill, your container should use auto layout, and it should also use fill. And then if you want your layout to wrap, you need to use min-max and also wrap. So when you set wrap, it's going to go to the next line if it reaches the min value of each of the child containers. So in this case, I set my child container to 420 for both. So at first, it's not going to go to the next line until each of these child container reach a size of 420. So as I make it smaller until I reach 420, then boom, it's going to go to the next line, and it's always going to fill the parent container. So that's exactly the behavior that is going to happen in CSS as well. Now let's start by finishing this container right here, and I'm going to go to dev mode. And then for the first container, I'm going to copy the code. And here, notice that we have this flex 100. This is what allows the wrapping to go to the next line and growing properly. So we're going to need to apply this in CSS as well. So first of all, I need to put all of this content inside its own div. So right click on H1, wrap that inside a div, and then I'm going to drag and drop all the elements inside that div. Let's select that container and set it a class name of content. Then go to edit code and apply the CSS property. Now what you're noticing here is a lot of extra spacing, and this happens a lot when you're working with a new project. You need to reset the CSS for some of these elements, such as the margins of the title, because if you don't do that, you're going to see by clicking on H1 that you do have a top and bottom margin, and these are the default HTML margins of H1. It was invented this way, so typically what designers do, they reset the CSS. And it's fairly easy to do that. You can go to the web, search for reset CSS. We're going to use the first result, and you can just copy all of this CSS right here and paste that in your index.css, which is for the global style. And by doing so, you're going to reset all of these default margins for H1, H2, and so on. So this is how Figma works, and it's going to be far more consistent from now on. Let's go to the parent container again. And again, I'm going to view the code. And so I'm going to select the parent container and copy the CSS code and then replace whatever was in app style. So I'm going to make this prettier, and voila. And then I'm going to add the image. So with the parent container selected, I'm going to add an image element. Now this one is going to be after the content. Make sure that it's not inside of the content. And then we're going to create an image style, then set the code by copying from Figma and then paste that to that image. If everything works properly, you should be able to resize it, and you should be able to see that it acts exactly like in Figma. If this is too big for you, you can always set it to 75% zoom, so it's going to be a lot easier to see. Now for the image, I'm going to select on it, and I'm going to go to properties, then change it to home image 1. Finally, we're going to select the app container, and we're going to edit the CSS code again. We're going to add a padding of 60 pixels. And while this is not the actual page that we're going to create, it gives you an idea of how it's going to look like on the final website. There are just a few final steps. First of all, I do have to mention that when you preview, you should be resizing the board and not necessarily the canvas itself, because if you do resize the canvas, it's going to stay that size for your website. As you can see, the canvas affects the website, but the board, which is the preview, doesn't affect it. So if you have customized the canvas width, you can just delete it, and it's going to stop using a fixed width. And typically you want to use a 100% width, or as we know, that would be the fill width in Figma. Now, the next thing is when I resize the window, you can see that it doesn't reach a certain min width and it doesn't go to the next line. So to fix that, we're going to go to the image and we're going to set the width to 100% instead. So this should solve the problem. And finally, we can take a look at the index.css. We do have some extra code that was already there before we added the variables as well as the reset CSS. Let me explain a little bit. These are global styles that apply to the entire website, and typically you want to have maybe a background color or link styles, as well as some customizations for buttons and so on. But since the reset CSS does the job for us, we don't need this code anymore. Having this global CSS can affect also your future buttons, which is why for now we're going to remove this code to keep things simple. All that's left is import the font, reset CSS, and then we have the font family that is set to manrope, as well as the variables. Now it's good to understand what everything does. You can see that the buttons has a default style with a border that looks like this. And that's why sometimes the reset CSS is going to take care of that. But if it's not, or when you create the style for the button itself from Figma, it has the value about the border, which is going to override this style right here. But you can also do button in your global CSS and set to border none by default. It's going to look more like what happens in Figma. And then now we can change the text of the buttons to fit the design. So I'm going to set preview in Figma. And also for this one, it's going to be free download. So going to the code, I'm going to set a background to transparent. Now, another issue that we're encountering is that the image doesn't respect the aspect ratio. As you can see, it tends to stretch a little bit, which is not what we want. On top of the fact that it does need a little bit of corner radius. So I'm going to set the border radius to 30 pixel. And also to fix that stretch issue, you can use object fit to cover. And so if you do that, then the image is going to stop stretching, and it's going to work exactly the same way as image fill aspect ratio in Figma. Now that we have learned how to create a basic layout using simple techniques such as manually creating HTML elements ourselves and copying the CSS from Figma, we can now think about what's beyond Figma and also how to copy entire CSS from not just an element, but a collection of elements and sometimes an entire page. So we're going to learn how to do that using Locofy. But first, we're going to take care of media queries. So in Figma, this is the equivalent of breakpoints. So a design like this one, you can see that it does take care of the wrapping as well as the min and max, but it doesn't hide the menu here, which should be a hamburger menu, but also the font size should change as well as the padding of the entire page. So we're going to take care of some of those standards for implementing the website. The other thing that we need to do from now on is to create multiple components because we don't have a single page. We're going to have a menu, we're going to have reusable components such as the header, but also gallery items and the footer. So it's time to actually go to home and create a component for each page, but also a component for the header as well as the footer. So the first thing we want to do is to take this content out of app, because app is only supposed to be the first thing that loads. And then from there, we should be including the home page component. So we need to create the home page component. So click on new component and we're going to name this one home page. Component name is going to be the same as the board name. As I mentioned before, the board is mostly just for previewing, and the component is what's going to be ending up in the actual website. So create the component, and then we're just going to bring exactly the same code as in the app. So this is going to be a crucial step for anyone who's learning code, is to know where to place things. Now, luckily for us, in the new component, we only have a few elements. And here we're using the class name as well as the style is already created for us when we create a new component. And if you go to view the code for the root CSS, it's actually just an empty class. We're going to change all of that. So we're going to go back to app, and then we're going to bring the content of the HTML. Remember that this is a React site, which means that it's a mix of JavaScript, but also HTML. And inside the HTML, you will have JavaScript as well, such as using CSS module, but also later on, you're going to learn how to do some loop and then data. But in this case, also, we're using JavaScript to import images. So the first thing to do is to copy the div to the end of that div. So in coding, it's super important to understand that everything that opens, such as a tag, but also a curly braces, has a beginning and an end. As long as you know where is the beginning and where is the end, you should be fine understanding how to copy the code. So in this case, the beginning of the HTML starts with this div, and it has a line that follows using indentation up until the end. And likewise for curly braces, you're going to see when I highlight the end or the beginning, it's going to show me both. The same with parentheses, and it's going to highlight the end of those parentheses. So let's go back to the div, copy all of this stuff, and then bring that to the homepage and go to the homepage.tsx, and we're going to find the div opening and then closing, select that, and then paste that code. Now it's going to give us some errors, and that is simply because in the other component, we have imported images, which is necessary in a React application. That's how you use images. You can also use prettier often to indent your code properly. And also when you have these comments, you can definitely delete them to keep your code cleaner. Now to fix the image error, if you're a little bit more advanced, you can definitely copy the actual code for importing the images. Or the other thing that you can do, which is a bit more manual, is to select the image itself and then click on the source property and then change the visualizer to a media and then reselect those images. So this one is going to be Figma. And when I select that, it's going to have the proper image, but also it's going to import the assets properly. Now that we have done one, we know what's going to happen when we import the other one using the more advanced techniques, which is going to the app. And then let's say I want to get the chevron as well as the home image. I'm going to copy these two lines and then bring this here and then paste, but it's going to give me an error. As I mentioned before, you have to understand how the path to your image works. Just like on your Mac computer, it has folders, and so you need to know exactly where it's from. So you can see that it's mapped differently from the app versus the homepage component. So I just need to follow exactly the same. So 2 dots and then / 2 dots again. I'm going to do the same for the third image, 2 dot and then 2 dots. As a result, it should be fine now. And I just need to bring the CSS, and this is a much easier task. So I'm going to go to the app module CSS, and I'm going to select everything, Command A, and then Command C to copy. Then I'm going to go to the homepage.css and copy all of that goodness. And now I have exactly the same content that I had before. And I can start just working directly from this component. And then from the app, instead of having all of that content, I'm just going to refer to the component. So the first thing you want to do is, as a rule, in React, you always need a parent container. In this case, we have the main div and we cannot delete this. Otherwise, it's going to stop working. So I'm going to delete everything inside that div. So I only have the main div left. And inside this div, I can insert a component. And voila, you have the homepage component that I can insert. And just like a component in Figma, it's going to include that instance with a single reference here. And as a result, I don't need to use these three images anymore. Figma, chevron, and home image, I can just delete that. And the home page is the component, and the styles is the CSS module, which can basically be empty at this point. So all that's left in my app.tsx is just a few lines of code, including the homepage component, which is what I'm going to edit from now on. Now, this is going to make a lot more sense as you advance in your project, because every page is going to be its own component. And also inside the component, you're going to have more components such as the header and the footer. So if you learn this aspect of coding, it's going to help you tremendously navigate the code of your React site, but also other people's HTML, CSS, and React code. Please keep in mind that if this seems a bit scary to you, try to work your way one line at a time. So for example, delete one image at a time or import one image at a time, and try to see as you go what kind of error message that you get, and then trace backward, back and forth, and you'll get more and more familiar with the way all of these pieces fit together. Okay, so let's talk about exporting the whole Figma design to code using React. And in this case, we're going to use an awesome new plugin that is actually free at the moment. It's called Locofy, and it's really good. Now, the first thing you want to search for is Locofy, and you're going to find information about this, and you can run the plugin. Now, by itself, it's actually really good for a lot of designers. You don't even need to get into the code yet. So the first thing is, with any design, you go to the classic mode or the AI mode, and it's going to give you suggestions on how to improve your design. So for example, how to optimize it. You click on fix, you create a project, and then it's going to give you a bunch of suggestions, such as apply auto layout, name your layers, and set up responsiveness. And eventually you get into the more advanced. We're not going to cover all of it because it should be a course on its own, but it's a really good way to get suggestions on how to improve your design. But also you can create a full site directly from Figma. So you can have interactions such as hovers or breakpoints and even animations and so on. So this is one way to use Locofy. You can get very far with it. You can organize the entire site with it, but also at the end, you're going to be able to export the entire site, and it's going to give you a zip of all of the files, including HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc. The part where we're most interested in is how to select an element or a page and export code directly. We're going to go to dev mode, and in dev mode, there's two ways to use plugins. The first one is through the inspect, and this allows you to get the code for each component. So for example, I'm going to go to Locofy, and I'm going to select the language that I want, such as React or HTML, or if you're using Next or Gatsby or Vue, as well as React Native for mobile development, you can choose that as well. In this case, we're going to use React. Now, this is component by component based, which means that whatever I'm selecting, it's going to give me the full component code. And you can see that it's fairly familiar compared to what we have learned just earlier about how to create a component. It imports the style, and then it creates the boilerplate for the component, including, if you have any props, and then setting up the parent div container, etc. And then finally, it gives you the CSS module, which is great. Also, you have the global CSS, which, as we've learned earlier, imports the font and also set up some basic body global style. So that's amazing. That's exactly what we're going to be using. There's also another way to use Locofy, which is to go to the plugins tab. And this is where, if you select Locofy, also need to select either the new Lightning or Classic. I'm going to use Classic. It's definitely more manual versus the other one is definitely using more AI. And this is where it's going to generate the full site code. We're not going to get into this. It's very similar to the inspect where we're going to go component by component, except that you're going to select the entire site. And you can also do that to some extent here. The only difference is that in the other ways, you can even download all the React files, so you don't need to set it up from scratch by yourself. Now, we're going to focus on element by element. This is the best way to integrate with Codux. So for example, if we want to create the header using all the code and not having to create all of these HTML elements and then the CSS styles one by one, we just need to select the header container, and then we want to copy the HTML. So all of that div in purple is what we're going to copy. And as you can see, it already creates the style names for you. So let's start with that. We're going to go back to Codux and go back to home. And this is where we're going to create a new component called header. So let's create this. And we have our usual boilerplate. I'm going to remove the comments, keep it minimal, but also I'm going to replace the div. As I mentioned before, this is really good knowledge for any designer, is to understand how to put the pieces together in terms of where to copy and paste the code or where to change and so on. It's a lot more efficient rather than, let's say, going one by one and then creating the style and back and forth. So in this case, I'm going to replace the entire div, opening and closing, and voila, it should look a little bit like this without the style. I'm going to set it to prettier, and it's going to be indenting everything. Obviously, the images are not going to work. As we've learned earlier, we need to import that later on. But for now, you can either select whatever element that you have and then select the style. You can also go and open the CSS directly. As I mentioned before, the CSS is always the name of the component plus .module.scss, and this might be a little bit faster for some. And so I'm going to go back to Figma, then scroll down a little bit to find all the CSS code. So I'm going to copy all of this goodness and replace all of the CSS from there. Look at that. Just from this, I have exactly the same design as I have in Figma. Imagine having a beautiful design that is perfectly organized with proper name, and then all of that amazing code generated for you, and you just need to tweak it a little bit. It's just really well done, has all the proper style. In this case, since we haven't used the advanced feature, which is definitely possible in other ways, you can even have variables included. But for the moment, we're just going to go with what we have. Obviously, I could have improved the names of the layers so that the names of the styles are a little bit better. But in this case, is a CSS modules, so it exists in isolation, which means that having a perfect name for everything is not as important as in the past. Not saying that it's not important, but definitely if it works, then it's amazing, especially as a beginner. You don't want to get too far ahead of yourself in terms of having the perfect names and the perfect code, etc. Just focus on making things work and making things adapt perfectly to the design, because it's going to make the designers happy, but also developers can come in and kind of clean things for you if they feel the need to do so, because all of this exists in a real React site. So they won't have a problem coming in and change the name of the styles or the name of the tags for you. So as I mentioned before, when it comes to images, yes, you can add a new line of code and just import it manually, but you can also go to the properties, and for the source of the image, I'm going to swap to a media, which is where I can select from all the images that I have imported earlier, and voila, this is working properly. Now you can see that everything is also completely adaptive because I set up all my wrapping and min-max. And so Locofy does a really good job at translating everything. Now, we will fix later on all the styling to be perfect, but for now, I think this is great, and I can definitely use this as a component. So going back to home page, I can click on the app, which is the main parent container, and I can add my new header component, and then boom, There we go. It exists perfectly. It also adapts with the rest of the content. Let's do the same for the gallery as well as the footer. So let's just copy the div. And this is really good practice for you as well as you go through this experience. So create a new component, gallery, and then create it. Walk through the motion of replacing the div and then replacing the CSS, which is gallery.scss, and then replacing the CSS code. The images are going to need to be replaced. So we're going to set each of them one by one. I'm going to fast forward this. And there we go. We're going to deal with the last component, which is the footer. So new footer, and create. Go to the footer. I'm going to select the other design, which is right next to it. And then I have the footer. So selecting the footer, I'm going to copy the HTML, just the div part. Sometimes the code is a little bit long, so just make sure that you selected it properly and have a opening and closing div. And we're going to do the same for the CSS. Opens footer.scss, replace the style, then replace the images. And voila. Now we're going to go back to the homepage, and we're also going to include the gallery component. And we're going to put that after the image. And finally, the footer component. And we're going to put that after the gallery. So here we do need an extra container for the div content. So we're going to select div.content, wrap that in the div, and then put the image next to it. And finally, the div itself is going to have a class also. So we're going to do that manually, and we're going to name that hero, but also we're going to use the old technique, which is the normal CSS of dev mode, because it only focuses on the element. It's still very useful. So use all the tools that are available to you, including Locofy, but also there are other plugins such as Variable to CSS, but also Anima and Figma to Code plugins. So use whatever is best. However, the main techniques that I'm showing you should apply pretty much to every single Figma to Code plugins with a few differences. Now, in this case, we have the hero class. So we're going to copy the style, and then we're going to select that div, apply the class called hero, then create, edit that code directly, and paste it. So now looking at the preview, you can see that everything works just perfectly. You can also go to the preview mode and you can scroll around, and it just looks really good. And we can, of course, tweak it even more and then apply variables. And of course, we're going to need to take it to the next level, which is to apply the media queries for the breakpoints so that when we resize, it's going to have the proper padding, but also the proper font size. And we're going to replace this with a hamburger menu. So if some of the designs are not perfectly integrated, you can always go back and use the normal inspect CSS. So for example, the logo is definitely not rendered properly. And I can see that by going to the code, and you can see that it doesn't have the same CSS properties. So I can just copy this from the inspect CSS in dev mode, and I can just replace whatever I have right now and set it to prettier to fix the indentation. And likewise, as a good practice, you can do for the rest of the layout. Breakpoints are something that designers are starting to use more and more. In fact, plugins like Locofy is going to let you take care of the breakpoints. So if you go to Classic again and you go to Edit Styling, this is where you can set the states for different elements. So for example, the title, you can have the desktop, the tablet, and the mobile version, each with their own max width. So anything that is 420 and below is going to have these properties that you can set. Now, there are two main things that affect the breakpoint. The first one is the spacing. So obviously having a 60 padding is way too much on a small screen like for mobile. So as you resize to a max width for mobile, you're going to reduce the padding to about 20 for mobile, and then 30 for tablet, and finally 60 for desktop. The other thing is the font sizes, and this typically mostly affect the titles because they're way too big for mobile. So if the title is about 50 for desktop, you will reduce it to about 40 for tablet and then 34 for mobile. And finally, there's the hiding and showing. So a menu like this would take too much space for mobile, which means that it's going to transform into a hamburger menu and it's going to appear to the right side. Now let's deal with all of these three cases in the code. So we're going to start with the home page. And this is where we can work with the 60 padding and make sure to edit the component and then select the container. And this is where you're going to set the code. And so you're going to be able to use what we call media queries, which are essentially conditions in which if you reach a certain min width or max width, then you will apply these CSS properties. I'm going to set media, parentheses, max width of 800 pixel and curly braces, and this is where I can apply the override for the styles. So in this case, I'm going to set a padding of 40 pixel. Then I'm going to add another media query, max width of 500 pixel, then set a padding of 20 pixel. So this is not a lot of code. It's something that you can do manually easily, and you don't have to apply to a lot of places. So this part is not as tedious as you might think. Now let me set the zoom to 75%. As you can see, when I reach to a width of about 800 and less, it's going to have a padding of 30. And then for mobile 500 or less, it's going to have about a padding of 20. So that's pretty straightforward. You should definitely apply that to every single page that has a large padding. If you want to get more into the details, you can also apply a different gap between elements. And obviously you need to be more granular, meaning that the more you get into the nested containers, the less the gap should be. But for the purpose of this course, I'm going to keep it simple and just apply it to the padding. Next, we're going to take care of the font size. And again, typically they're applied to the large titles. So anything above 20 pixels in terms of font size should be adapted for mobile and tablet. So I'm going to edit the code. And for the title specifically, I can definitely copy these two media queries to make my work easier for the title. And instead of padding, I'm going to set the font size to about 40 for tablet, and then font size to about 34 for mobile. All of these numbers should be part of your variables from your design system. You're going to go to the font size, and typically you would have the desktop version sizes and tablet as well as mobile. Now, this is also available as a feature on Locofy, which means that you can set up everything from Figma and then export that to a React project. But in this case, again, we want to use Codux to be able to collaborate with engineers and also create a full-fledged website with all the extra bells and whistles. The next thing, as I mentioned before, is to be able to replace this top right menu by a hamburger menu for mobile. And typically you would want to design the drawer menu or the popover menu. You will also need the design of the hamburger menu. So we're going to take the one in light mode. And then I'm going to switch to code and switch to React from Locofy. This is where I'm going to copy the HTML code. So going to the header, I'm going to select the logo and I'm going to put that hamburger menu right after and then fix my indentation. Then I'm going to copy the CSS style. So we have 3 classes. I'm going to put that in the CSS right at the end. And I do see a little bit of a problem with the width, and this is a common issue that you need to keep an eye on, which is that usually the parent container is going to have a bit of a width problem. Sometimes they use 100% width, so you're going to have to remove that or adjust it. Then the next thing is to change the image. So I like to do it safely by allowing Codux to import the image for me. I'm going to switch to the media. and then search for menu, and then find this one. The other thing that I want to do is to align everything in the container to be in the center. And so by going to style, I can edit the code, then find that the align items should be center. Now for the media queries, the first thing I want to do is to select the right menu here and then edit the style. And then at the very end, I'm going to add the media query, which is max width of 800. And if that's the case, then I'm going to display none, which is how I can hide something at a max width of 800, as you can see like this. Then for the button itself, going to the style, I'm going to set a media query where the max width of 800 is going to be the opposite. So display flex, but by default, it should be display none. So the default value is what is outside of media queries, but otherwise, when it has a max width of 800, it's going to go back to flex, which is the stack layout that I have by default. So if everything works fine, it should act accordingly. And if I go to the home page, this is where I have the real preview. And as you can see, it works perfectly for tablet and mobile. I can also switch to the actual website and voila, it's amazing. The next thing we need to do is to apply a button action, which means that when I tap on this, it's going to show the drawer menu. And so we're starting to pick up more tools and techniques and create a much more interesting application that is interactive and fun. So we're going to learn about component states. All right, so in Figma, we're going to go to the drawer and then we're going to copy the code itself. Now you can set everything in Locofy and the code is going to look like this, but obviously it requires someone with a bit more experience in React to understand what's going on here. So we're going to focus on the simple parts, which is just the styling, and then we're going to learn how to create the interactive part from scratch so that you understand better what's going on. As you can see, Locofy does create these interactions using states, and so having a hamburger menu like this, it's quite possible to do everything in Figma. Now we're going to copy all of the HTML div from the start to finish. Then in Codux, we're going to create a new component called drawer, then create. Then again, using the same technique, we're going to select the div, replace that, prettify. Then we're going to switch to the CSS module and then copy the CSS code. Keep in mind that if you do have animation properties, sometimes they start with opacity of 0. You can always do Command F, search for opacity, and that is typically what happens if you don't see anything at all. It's either that or you're using a white color, which typically is the dark mode colors. So those are the two main reasons why you wouldn't see anything. In this case, I'm going to remove the opacity. The animation code here is mainly because in Locofy, I was able to set up the slide in animation. If you understand some of this code, it's easy to customize them. This is another good lesson, is that I'm noticing that the font is incorrect, and it's a common case where you set the font in Figma and it's going to carry in your CSS. So we're going to search for font family, and here I have Inter, but I haven't imported the font, which means that it's going to fall back to something like Times New Roman, and it looks weird. So I'm just going to remove this property, and it's going to take it from the global font, which is Manrobe. So with these two fixes, I was able to have my full drawer design. And so I'm going to switch to the header. This is where I have my hamburger button. So what I'm going to do is to select the parent container and add my component, that is the drawer. So drawer component, it's going to look like this. And this is where it's good to understand how position absolute and fix works. So position absolute typically is going to be dependent on the parent container position. And you can see that a lot in designs where you have a floating element. So typically this in CSS is the equivalent of a position absolute, depending on the position relative of the parent container. So in Figma, you have this property called absolute position, and you can apply this to any element that is part of a auto layout. If it's not part of auto layout, it's simply going to always use position absolute, but otherwise you can explicitly apply that to an element within auto layout. Now in the form of a code, you can go here and find the circle button, and you can see that it's using position absolute. Another way to use absolute positioning is to have a floating menu, such as a header navigation at the very top that floats regardless of the scrolling, but also a drawer that floats regardless of the scrolling as well. Now, because I already have a component that includes all of those style, if I want to apply extra styling, I should wrap this inside a div, and that div is going to contain the extra styling with the positioning. Now with that div selected, I'm going to set a drawer style and create it. Then I'm going to edit the CSS, and in this case I'm going to use a position fix. As a result, it's not going to take any physical space, and it's floating in a 3-dimensional space, and so it's now above or behind the current element. Then when you have position fixed or absolute, you want to use values similar to constraints, and I'm going to constrain it from the right at 0 pixel and from the top at 0 pixel. So regardless of where I scroll and what the parent container is, it's always going to stick to the right and top 0. The next thing I need to understand is about the Z index, which allows me to float on top or below elements. So I can set Z index of 10 to be above everything. Now I do notice that I don't have a background color for my drawer. So I'm gonna quickly switch to that drawer and then check the style, and I'm going to set a background color to white. So back to my header, I should be able to see that drawer not being transparent against the elements below. Now that I have my styling done, I can essentially take care of hiding it, but instead of using display none, I'm going to use JavaScript, specifically React. So I'm going to set a condition, and this is how you set a condition using curly braces, and the condition is going to be called is drawer visible and end, and if that's the case, parentheses, and whatever is inside the parentheses is what's going to show based on that condition. So let's set the indentation. It looks a little bit like this. It does give me an error, and that's because I haven't declared my isDrawerVisible variable. Now the way that you do it in React for setting a state is to set the code right before return and inside the curly braces of my component header, and then I'm going to set const square brackets is drawer visible, comma, and then set drawer visible. The first one is the variable, and the second one is the function for switching, which we're going to create later. Now these values are equal to, then we're going to use state, which is from React, and then inside the parentheses we're going to set the default value to false. So meaning that by default the drawer is not visible. When you see a problem like this, is because we haven't imported the use state from React. So we're going to need to do that. Import curly braces use state from React. And there you go. We have the ability to use this function from the React library. And using this function, we have our variable, and then we have another function that is going to be activated for toggling true or false. But by default, it's false. So let's create the function const toggle drawer is equal empty props, and then fat arrow using equal sign and pointy brackets, curly braces, and this is where we're going to set the task for the function. We're going to set the set drawer visible parentheses opposite of is drawer visible. You don't need to manually set the semicolon. You can always use Prettier. It's going to set it for you or not, depending on your settings. What this means here is simply that it's going to change the value from true to false, and using the exclamation point, it's going to toggle the value from true to false and back and forth. There's just one last step, and it's that when I have my button here, I want to be able to click on it and then trigger the function for toggling true and false. So I'm going to find this button right here, and I'm going to set onClick, which is usually how you call a function using React, but inside HTML. So onClick is equal to curly braces, and we're going to call the function toggle drawer. Now with this, I should be able to go to preview and open my drawer when I click on that button. Now we just need to figure out a way to dismiss it when we tap outside, and that's going to require a little bit more code, which is why I want to show you that you can use AI for this type of task, especially as a beginner. But otherwise, everything works properly, especially if you go to the home page and you switch to the mobile version, you click on it, you should be able to see your drawer. For now, if you want to reset, you can always click on reload preview, and it's going to reset the states. And here I'm noticing a little bit of an issue with some of the styling, so let's fix them. I'm going to go to the drawer, and first I'm going to start with these images. So let's change them to media. Once all the images are changed, I can fix the size of the icon. So I'm going to go to the code, and the image itself is not the proper size, so I'm going to set it to 44 by 44 and remove the border radius. The next thing is I do have some extra spacing, so let me go to the code. I can see that my problem is the max width to 90%. Sometimes unintentionally there are issues with the design. You have to fix this in CSS, but otherwise you can always go back to your design and fix them from the root, so the next time you export the styling, it's going to work perfectly. All right, so it's time to get more and more complex. And because we're going to increase in complexity, this is where AI is going to come in handy. So I'm going to show you a few tricks that I know and how to code outside of Codux, because Codux is not really meant to do all the coding there. You're supposed to let developers edit the code in a tool like VS Code, and especially using AI tools such as Copilot to help your work. It's going to be a lot more meaningful and less prone to errors. Now it's time to learn about the developer experience, and that is going to really help us understand the collaboration, but also for bigger tasks such as working with data, but also using AI. It's much better to use a dedicated code editor such as VS Code. So you're going to want to head to Visual Studio and download the version for your system. In my case, it's going to be the Mac. It's going to look a little bit like this, and here you can definitely install a bunch of extensions. They are like plugins. So the ones that I recommend is definitely GitHub Copilot with Chat, Figma, Locofy, Prettier, and VS Code Speech. Once you have that, you're going to head to the files. Obviously, you're going to need to create an account for most of these applications, such as GitHub, etc. It's fairly easy to find guides online by Googling about it and following instructions. But also, at any point, you can ask your developer for help or friends with more experience. Once you have everything set up, you can definitely use the AI like ChatGPT or Copilot directly in VS Code to give you instructions and to ask questions about coding. This is going to be super useful. Now for the project that we have, we're going to open the project and it's going to open this. Now a few essential things that you're going to need. First, Node, which is the package manager that takes care of getting all of those libraries. Think of them as the plugins, but for code. And so you're going to need to install this for your system. And inside your project folder, typically you have a README file. In this README file, it's going to give you the instructions on how to install your specific project. And you can see here, most of them is going to tell you how to run the project. You do need to install all the libraries for your project. Most likely they are already installed if you're not on a new machine, or if Codux didn't install them for you. But if you didn't, using Node that we installed earlier, you can do Command J to open the terminal, and you can do npm install. So this is going to install all the missing libraries to make your application work. And then following the README instructions, each project is going to be different. And in this case, we're going to need to do npm run dev. So this is going to start the project from our VS Code. And so it's going to generate a local host, which is the local environment, and it's going to allow you to reach your website from a local address that only exists on your computer. So this is what it's going to look like if you were to publish it online, except it's using your computer as a local environment. Now there's another application that I really like, and I'm going to close VS Code, and it's very similar to VS Code, except that it already comes with a lot of these extensions that normally you have to install, such as prettier theming and stuff like that. It's called z.dev, and it's actually faster. It allows you to use AI to change the code for you. And this I found to be really useful. Now, once you download the application and you open the project, it's going to look a little bit like this. You can drag and drop the project folder into the application itself. It works exactly the same as in VS Code. You can do Command J to open the terminal. Then you can set npm run dev to start the server. It's going to work pretty much the same way, except that the difference is you can change the code using AI. So now I'm gonna open the src folder, and this is where I can find all my files. It's really good to be familiar with where the files are, such as you have the packages file at the root, you have the src folder, typically where you have all your project files, and then in your project files you have the assets, which are the images, components. These are created automatically by Codux. So for each component, it's going to have that name and that folder inside the components folder. And also it has an extra Codux folder where it puts all of that board. Again, this is not necessary for a real React project, but it is necessary for your Codux project, meaning that you need this in order to visualize all of those components and work with their visual editor. Let's go to components and find the header and header.tsx. This is where we put all of the code earlier. And so the first thing that you need to know is that whatever you edit here is going to change live on your Codux project. So for example, if I remove code in my logo text and I switch to Codux to the header, I can see that it automatically changed everything. It's in real time. So I'm going to put it back, and now I'm going to start to use AI to help me with some of these tasks. So there are three ways to use AI. The first one is auto-completion. And when you're about to write something, so for example, I haven't written drawer and I have already a suggestion going on, and I can always use tab to auto-complete for me. In this case, it added an extra style, but most of the time it's really accurate. I would say 90% of the time. It's also really good for importing component directly from code. So for example, I can start typing open brackets drawer, and here I have a bunch of menu. This is not necessarily using AI, but it's really good for importing automatically and getting the proper path to that component. In this case, this is the one. And then auto completion using AI again, I can just press tab and it's going to auto complete that end tag. The second way is to use chat, and you can go to the chat interface either using Copilot in VS Code, or you can do that using GPT-4. But keep in mind that if you want to use the GPT-4 version, you're going to need to set up your API key for that. In this case, I'm going to use GPT-4o, and so I'm going to type, I want to be able to dismiss the drawer when I tap outside of it. Depending on how much context your current file has around the task, you can either choose the open files or the entire project. So using the open file, it should be able to do a pretty good job. And so using the chat, it's going to give me instructions on how to do it. And I think this is a pretty good solution. But again, for a lot of beginners, this might be a little bit daunting. So specifically for Z, what you can do, and instead of following instruction, I'm going to ask it to change the code for me. And let's see how it goes. Now, the best result is when you know exactly what code is going to be affected. So this requires a little bit more familiarity, but in case of this course, I'm going to tell you. So obviously we're going to need the button where we're toggling the drawer, but also all the way to the cons is drawer visible, where we set the state and then the function for toggling. We're going to do Control Enter, and then we're going to paste that prompt. I want to be able to dismiss the drawer when I tap outside of it. So press Enter. Let's just hope for the best. And it's going to change all of the code for us. Now, I was not able to make it work exactly. Maybe what I'm asking is a little bit complex, but I did want to show you how it works and how you would be able to ask it to change the code for you. So at this point, I just revert back to where we were. I'm going to show you how to do that step by step. First, we're going to import useRef and useEffect. I'm going to do a lot of copy and paste just because there's going to be a lot of coding. And this is the part where coding from scratch can be too complex. And just showing you the steps is going to guide you to create the dismiss function that we want. The first thing is you need to import the right functions from React. So we're going to use ref, which is really useful for targeting specific elements of the UI. And then useEffect is good for setting the lifetime of a state. So for example, when something happens or after a certain time or when the application loads, this is where you're going to use useEffect. The next part is to set the drawer ref, and by default is going to be null. And again, this is useful for targeting. Then we're going to set the functions that is going to handle the click outside. So this is going to use a mouse event, and then it's going to set the reference and then target outside. Finally, we need to listen to these events. And the final step is to find the drawer itself and apply the ref. So ref is equal to drawer ref, which is what we set earlier right here. So if you don't understand what's going on in some of this code, you can always copy and go to the chat and then ask about it. Explain and then paste the code, and then it's going to explain you what's going on. You should be able to test it and resize. Then you can see when I tap outside, it's going to dismiss that drawer menu. Again, it's really good to experiment. Unfortunately, the thing with AI is that regardless of what we try to do, it's not always going to give you the same answer for every single time or every single person. Now that you are equipped with this tool, you can use it on any AI tool. You can chat, you can ask questions, and with some luck, you can even apply it directly to your code. So I think that's pretty awesome. In fact, I was able to get this technique from AI in one of the prompts. So that shows you the power of AI if you give the right instructions. As you work in a real coding environment, one thing that really helps you when it comes to adding new code and changes is to commit your files. Basically, if you have used Figma for publishing your components to the team and for them to review the changes, this is going to work pretty much the same way. Now, obviously, you can do that in the code, and most developers are quite familiar with this. But for designers who's never done this, the easiest way to do it is to go to Codux and commit your changes. Now, it's going to ask you to enter a message. So for every time that you have something new and you want to commit, you're going to create a message to make it more clear about what you're working on. So since this is the first commit, usually you name it initial commit, and then moving forward, every time that you create a new change, you're going to say something like new drawer or added styles to drawer or something like that. And it's going to synchronize with the code editor, and you can see from this point forward, it doesn't have the yellow anymore. And anytime that you add a new change, you can see these highlights from your code editor depending on your theme, and you're going to see what is new. So these cues are really going to help you when adding new elements to your code. On top of that, there are extensions that are really useful, such as knowing when this line of code was last committed. So for example, this one is 1 minute ago. In Z, this is built in. In VS Code, you have extensions such as GitLens that gives you this information. This is especially useful working in a team because you're going to know who touched what code. Now, having those commits sent, it doesn't mean that it's going to go to the cloud or even to your team. This is all happening locally for now. If you want to send it to your team, you're going to have to publish it to a GitHub project. Most likely, if you're in a team, you already have the GitHub project and it's already connected. But if you haven't done that and you're working solo, you're going to need a GitHub account and connect it. And finally, you will be able to create a new repo in the cloud where you're going to create a new one, whether it's public or private. And then you're going to create. So this is going to send your project to the cloud so you can share it with your team, and you're going to be able to see what commits have been done so far. And here we have a history of all the changes that we have made. And once committed, you're going to be able to open your project online. There are apps out there such as VS Code Dev, which allows you to work directly from a GitHub repository. But also later on, we're going to learn how to publish your website using a GitHub repo. So it comes with a lot of superpowers. Another thing that is useful to learn is how to deal with some of these messages. There's the blue one and there's the red one. The blue ones are easy, and typically you can also get the suggestions by going to this icon here on the left side, and it's simply going to give you a suggestion on removing something that is not used. You can also have a button that remove all unused code. So for example, if I click on it, it's going to remove all of those unused code. And similarly here as well, remove unused code. But otherwise, if it gives you the wrong suggestions or if it's not working out the way you want, you can always copy the error message right here and then put that to ChatGPT and ask what to do. Now in this case, I'm just going to remove unused code, and now it's all clean. All right, now we're gonna dial back a little bit and we're going to learn about CSS animation, specifically appear animation, hover interactions, and keyframes animations. So right now, you can see that it's pretty static. And sometimes if you have set it up in Locofy, it's going to have a hover. But if you haven't, then you're gonna have to code that manually. And once you have a system in place, it's going to be fairly easy to apply to the rest. We're going to start with the drawer animation. So right now it's pretty instant, and what you can do quickly is to be able to make it fade in, or you can also slide from the right. So at this point, since we're touching a lot of code, I definitely recommend using the coding environment as you get more familiar. It might be scary at first, which is why I think it's good to get started with Codux first and use the visual editor. But for any heavy duty, such as dealing with interactions, animations, and anything that is not available in the visual editor, you should go straight into the code. Codux has organized our files cleanly, meaning that our components are inside the components folder, and then you have the name of the components. Here we're going to touch the header file, and then the element that we're going to animate is the drawer itself. And we're going to go to the style by heading to the header module, and then we're going to find the drawer. So the first thing we need to do is to set the animation itself, and you're going to see how easy it is with auto-completion using Copilot. So we're going to start typing keyframes, fade in, but as we type it, you can already see that for a lot of common cases, it already knows what to do and how to write it, which is amazing. It's going to save you a lot of time from all of this typing. This is a good template for a fade-in animation. And then you're going to save. Depending on your prettier settings, it might need to add different indentation, which is why I'm seeing a lot of changes. And then the second thing is, because we're starting the animation, We're going to start with opacity 0. Again, auto completion really nicely. And then we're going to set the animation, and you can see that it auto completes nicely for us. Now, it's important to understand that the auto completion is not going to be 100% accurate. So for example, here, it gives me two values. The first one is the duration, and the second one is the delay. I don't need the delay, so I'm going to remove this one, and I have a duration, and I can customize it. Obviously, as you get more familiar with CSS, you're going to know exactly what these values are, but if you're not, you can always ask ChatGPT. So with this done, I can try on the website, and I can see I have a fade-in animation now. If I want to add a little bit more, such as a transform, I can do transform, and again, it has auto completion. This is pretty good, except that instead of using Y, I'm going to use X, and instead of -20, I'm going to use 20. So with this done, I'm going to go to the 100%. So this is the beginning and the end, and I'm going to type transform again, and it does a good job of resetting back to the normal 0 pixel. As a result, you should be able to see a nice slide in from the right. And while this seems like a little feature, this is actually really useful as you code more and more. Which is why, as a designer, if you know just enough code to be dangerous, you can quickly figure out what all of these auto completion can do for you and make the proper adjustments and code so much faster in the future. Now, the next thing we're going to do is to do the appear animation, and this is going to happen on the home page. So we're going to switch to homepage.tsx. Ideally, when you deal with CSS, you don't want to touch anything in the HTML. You want to keep it clean and readable. So we're going to head straight to the homepage.module, and you also want to separate the CSS animation as much as possible, especially when it comes to keyframe animation. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the title, subtitle, and text. Sometimes it does add extra code such as this, which is unnecessary. And then obviously right now it gives me auto completion for text alignment. That's not what I want to do. And so I'm going to remove this, but I also want to add two more elements such as dot buttons and dot image. So with this, I'm going to do the same technique. So opacity 0, and I'm going to set my animation using keyframes. And again, it's going to give me the nice fade-in animation as a template. And from here, we're going to use the same technique for transform, and then autocomplete using the translate Y. This is already great. I'm going to use -20. Feel free to use your own values for animation. And finally, we're going to set it back to 0. So with this, I just need to make sure to set the animation. And again, we're going to use fade in. So in this case, we have the duration, the animation timing, but also forwards, which means that as the animation is done, it's going to stay there at 1 opacity. If you don't put forwards, it's just going to reset back to the initial position, which is opacity 0. So forward is extremely important. If I test this, you can see that I have a nice appear animation. However, I do want to have a sequence animation. So I want to have some delay, which means that I'm going to do one by one. So the title autocomplete using animation delay is 0.1, and then subtitle 0.2, text 0.3, buttons, image. Super nice auto completion. It knows exactly what I wanted, and now I have this beautiful delay animation. Now let's talk about transition animation, because this is useful for buttons, such as these two buttons right here. Typically the hover state, you can put them directly. So it's definitely good to go back to the HTML to know what is the class name. In this case, we have button and then button 2. So using those names, I can just reference the button and then add a hover. And then now I have auto completion. It does a really good job, again, of knowing what I'm going to be using. Obviously, these variables don't exist, but at least it gave me a default value. Now the values that I'm going to use is these background color using the variables. And as I mentioned before, this is going to be pretty much used throughout the whole application. And the reason why I'm using variables is that later on I'm going to be able to support a light mode and dark mode. And also I want to be consistent. So every time that I have a hover, I'm going to use these 2 lines of code. I'm going to do the same for button 2, hover. It has an instant animation, which is where the transition comes in. The difference between animation and transition is that keyframe allows you to set the animation. So using the percentage values, you can really create something custom like a timeline animation in most animation tools. But the transition is only going to have the beginning and the end. It's going to smart animate between the 2 states. So I'm going to apply my transition to both of these buttons, button and then button 2, and I'm going to set my transition, then I'll set to 0.8 second, and now I have a nice transition. I can use animation timing or cubic Bezier. So you can use one of these values with these suggestions. The one that I like is 0.2, 0.8, then 0.2 again, and then 1. So this gives me a nice animation timing. I can definitely set this transition as a variable in the future, or I can just select all the CSS classes that I want to apply this to in my list, and it's going to have this nice transition for me. So as a homework, you should definitely play around with these keyframe animations and try to apply to different places of the UI, but also you should apply hover animation to different buttons of the UI, and feel free to use the style that you want in terms of the colors and variables, as well as the transition and the animation timing. Next, we're going to learn how to pass props to a component. For example, these gallery images should not be just one component, because in the future you might have 10, 12 images and you want to load them one by one and to pass a prop to each of them. So in order to do that, you're going to need data, and then you're going to need to loop through that data and then pass the prop to each item one by one. So we're going to learn to do that. But first, it's always good to create a component directly in Codux first. So let's name this one gallery item and then create. Once it's created, we can go back to Figma and get the HTML and CSS code quickly. So I'm going to paste this as a beginning. So I'm going to repeat those steps and then get the CSS code, gallery CSS. In this case, it's gallery item, and then paste the code. Now it's just missing the images. And from this point, I actually can go straight into the code because it's a little bit more heavy duty and AI is going to come in handy. So the first thing is I have a new component that I just created from Codux. This is necessary for the structure and to make sure that the visual editor is fully working based on the system of Codux. It's also nice to not have to go through the steps of creating the folder, creating the file, and the CSS that goes with it. So it saves me a lot of time. Now in React, each component can receive properties. We call them props. And you can see here the class name is actually a prop, and this is used for the CSS. However, since we're using the code from Figma, we don't really need this specific one, so we can just remove unused code. And I'm going to use this one as well. So this class name here as a prop, we're using TypeScript. This is a good way. If you're not aware, TypeScript is a little bit more strict in terms of what type of data that you're passing or you're using. And we do that to make sure that it gives us the proper warnings and error messages so that you don't need to work on something and never be really warned about what goes wrong in your code early on. Yes, it's a little bit harder at first, but it's also going to save you a lot of time debugging your app in the future. Now let's create a prop for the image because we want to pass the prop, which is an image, and then apply that to the component image. So we're going to name this one image question mark. And the reason for question mark is that it's optional. If the image is empty, it's still going to work. And then it's going to be of type string because in CSS, every image is referenced to the path name. So once you have the props set up, you're going to pass that to the component itself. And we can just put image. And for the source, we're going to replace the quotes by curly braces image. This is how you bring variables to your HTML. However, it's always good to have a default value so that you can see what's going on in your UI. So for every image, if you remember, we have to import them one by one. So I want to import two images. The first one is the bookmark SVG and the second one is the home image 2. These are going to be my default image, and therefore, because they're variables themselves, I can just set image equals to home image 2 JPEG, which is the same name as this one. And also we're going to use the bookmark SVG, so replacing the bookmark icon by using that one. Another good practice when working with images for accessibilities is to add the alt title. So for example, the bookmark is going to be bookmark icon. Obviously, you can be a lot more descriptive. And for the alt, I'm going to use a component prop. So I'm going to set alt and apply alt here as well with a default value of image. Then finally, I'm going to apply the alt to my image. So in Codux, I can test that it's working nicely by itself, but because this is a component, I can pretty much use it anywhere in my app as well. So I'm gonna go to Gallery TSX, and here you can see that each of these three images are done manually, and each of them are imported manually. Let me remove the comment. And so the first thing I'm gonna do is just to replace all of this manual code and then import that component. Now, whenever you import a component, especially in VS Code, you don't need to worry about the path because it's going to know automatically where it's from. It's going to import it for you. So for example, I'm going to open the brackets, gallery item, make sure that you have the proper name and click on it. It's going to know that I want to import specifically this component and it gives me the right path. So that saves a ton of time. And now I can just autocomplete, then remove whatever I think is unnecessary. So for example, the class name is not necessary. The title is actually called alt. If it's not correct, it's going to give you an error. Then always make sure to close whatever tag that you have. And voila. Now going back to the website, you can see that we only have a single image. Now we need to learn how to loop through a data. This can be done through an API from data on the web, but if you have something that is very simple, you can always hard code the data directly from either a file or direct from the JavaScript file that you currently have. So we're going to start with an array. So const images, and here it knows that I want to have a bunch of images. So I'm going to use autocompletion. Then using this array, I can now set my loop. So in React, it's simply going to be open brackets, images, and again, it knows exactly that this is the loop code that I want. So I'm gonna set autocompletion, and then it's going to open the parentheses, and I need to close it. Now inside the parentheses is where I'm gonna put my component. So I'm gonna cut that and put that in, and voila. So I do need an additional parentheses. So make sure to keep track of your parentheses. So for example, you have one right here, which ends here, and then you have another one which ends here, and then you have the curly braces. So right now you can see that all three images are the same, and that's because I haven't included the image from the array. So instead of using manually this one, I'm going to use the image from the array, and now I have three different images. Next, I want to add the alt value, and this is going to require me to break down the data into multiple variables. So for example, Now it's going to be a dictionary. When you have a dictionary, then you need to have the name and then the value. So this is going to be image, colon, value, and then comma, then alt, and then we're going to set image 1. So I can ask help from AI, fix props for all images. So it did that for me. It's a fairly easy task. So AI can definitely come in handy. Now, because we have a dictionary, that means that the image that we have, it's going to have multiple values using the dot notation. So instead of having image, it's going to be image.image. It's also a good idea to rename. For example, now it's going to be an item instead of an image. So item.image makes more sense. And as well, we're going to have the alt. So item.alt. Another thing that's a good practice to do when you do looping is to use the key value. So for the gallery item, we're going to set key is equal to index. So that's how you create a component, pass the image prop as well as the title, and then create data to be able to loop through that and apply the values from a dictionary instead. Now, from this point, I'm going to create the browse page, but also I'm going to fix this hover so that it only appears when I hover the image. Let me go to the gallery item, the container itself, and I think it's going to be faster to do it in Codux. Now here, because it's SCSS, you can use nested selectors. So I can select the circle button inside the parent container dot circle button, curly braces. By default, it's going to have opacity 0. I'm going to create a hover of that container and colon hover and selecting the circle button, then set to opacity 1. So by using this technique, you can see that it's only going to appear when I hover the container, and it also targets that circle button. I can add a small transition quickly, transition 1s, 1 second, and now I have a nice little transition. All right, so let's create the browse page. It's going to be very similar to the home page, and so I'm going to create a new component, call it browse page, and then create. Now let's remove the comment, keep it clean. I'm going to remove the text and add my components that I want for my page. Typically, you're gonna go to component and starting with the header, then the footer. And now I'm going to deal with the content in the middle. First, I just want to set my container styles, which I'm going to steal from the home page. So home page CSS. My container style is the .app. I'm going to copy the CSS properties, bring that to browse, and then let's just go directly to the code. In this case, it's using root, so I'm going to use that without changing anything. It already has the media queries for me, so that's great. And now I'm going to deal with the content of the browse page. So let's go back here, and right after header, I'm going to go to the browse page, and I'm going to copy all of this code right here for that menu, paste the HTML, then copy the CSS and bring that to the CSS after everything. Now let me fix the icons. So this should be adaptive, which is really nice. Now for the loop, I'd rather use the code editor. It's going to be a lot easier. I'm going to go to the browse page, get to the TSX file. So this is going to be right after the menu, and I'm going to copy pretty much what I had in the gallery. So this is going to be good practice for copying code. This is something that programmers use all the time, and you will definitely get better over time. Just make sure to do this step by step and understand what's going on. Now the first thing is I'm going to copy the container for the gallery, go back to browse, and then bring that here. Obviously, it's going to have issues with the variables, but let me deal with the CSS first. So the style is going to be called gallery. So I'm just going to use the gallery style and then bring that to browse CSS. Then I'm going to deal with the data. I can also copy the data. So going to the gallery, I'm going to start with this array of images that I had. and then bring that to my browse page. You can see that we have two errors. It's important to understand what they are. The first one is that we haven't imported these images, and the second one is that we haven't imported the component. I'm gonna copy these component and images. Now going back to the browse, I'm going to paste that. If everything works properly and you don't see any error messages anymore, then you should be fine. So it's always a good idea to test your code visually, either by starting the server and test that in a browser, but also in Codux. I think it's a lot easier, especially if you're a visual person. This is normally something that you do by inspecting the browser. But in this case, you can see that the gallery is inside the div menu, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to drag that outside of the menu. And so if it's outside, then it should look fine. But everything is working properly. Just like on the home page, I just want different images. So in this case, I'm just going to copy the data directly. So replacing const images and removing the ones that are from the home page. And I'm going to paste that data. I have different images imported, and I also have a different content for my array using those images that are imported. And whatever else for the loop, it should still be working. I do have an issue where I did name my array a little bit differently, so just make sure to keep an eye on some of these issues. But having type safety, having AI, it's going to really help you see where the problem is and what you can do to solve those problems. And again, this is something that you get better over time. Now going back to Codux, you can see that I have a beautiful page with the header component, the footer component, but also the loop of the images that I wanted. And they are different. I have also a new menu right here, and that's really nice. All right, so at this point, we're pretty much done with creating new components and pages. We can start applying all the variables, but also make it work for dark mode. So this is going to include a few steps. As I've shown you earlier, the first thing is to export the dark mode variables. You can do that by going to variables to CSS and colors, and then generate ignore alias. It's going to give you the light and dark mode. Using those values, I'm going to go to the app, and then I'm going to find the index.css. Here, this is where I have my global CSS, and I also have my variable colors. And for the root where you have your variable colors, we're going to add a new media query just for dark mode. So now I'm going to set media, parentheses, prefers color scheme, dark, curly braces. And this is where I'm going to paste my dark mode variables. You can already see that it's going to stop working properly. Every time that you use variable colors, it's going to adapt to the dark mode version, which means that it's white on white. Now, the first thing to do is to make the background of the website to be using variable. So we're going to use the body. It's going to have a background color using var, and then it's going to be called background primary. By doing this, you can see that all the colors are now in dark mode. We just need to make sure that everything else is going to be applied one by one using variables. Keep in mind that you can always go inside components from wherever you are, such as from the app. You can edit all the components that are included and all the nested components. So for example, I can go to header, then I'm going to go to the text logo, and this is going to be called foreground primary. Now, what about the images? Especially icons, they have a single color and it's an asset. So we can actually use a trick for this one. And it's a really cool trick by using CSS filter. So the way I'm going to do it is to go to the code and then setting the media query for that specific image. And I'm going to use filter invert then 1. So what this does is that it's going to invert the color. If you're using white, then it's going to go to black. And this is a clever way to not have to create an additional image just for your icon. Obviously, it only works if you have colors that can invert easily, But if you have normal colors, the way that you're going to do about it is to simply change the image itself for the dark mode media query. However, it's good to know that most websites use white icons. So this is a really powerful technique that I use all the time. Now the rest is to go to all of these values one by one. You can also do a search for color, and then you can sort of replace the values. So for example, 0.7 opacity is the same as foreground secondary. So I'm going to copy and replace. Make sure that if you include a semicolon, the replacement should also have semicolon. And so you can replace them one by one. Now 0.5 is going to be tertiary. Then 0.1 should be container divider. Then the white color itself should be background primary. Black color should be foreground primary. The 0.2 opacity is container divider secondary. 0.2 opacity should be container divider secondary. This is where it's obviously time consuming to have to apply all of these hover interactions, dark mode variables, but the technique is there, and you do have the final site that is provided with the final code. While we're not going to go through applying all of them for the rest of the content, the technique is there, and use this as a practice for your UI. Now, once you have applied all the dark mode variables and the variables themselves, you should be able to find that the colors work properly in dark mode. And this is going to use your system settings, meaning that you're going to go to appearance and then switch between light and dark mode. You're going to be able to test those dark mode colors. So to summarize, you're going to go to each of those CSS files and you're going to replace the colors that are hard-coded using RGBA or FFF, and then you're going to replace this with a variable one by one. It's time-consuming, but that's just the way it is, and that is typically the job of a designer, to make it much easier to contribute to the team. Another thing that can save you a lot of time is, for example, for the whole menu or for a whole component, you can set the dark mode scheme, and then you can target specific elements such as images, as long as it doesn't interfere with other images that are not supposed to use inverted colors. And then you apply the filter invert 1, which is going to apply to all of the icons for dark mode. Next, we're going to use React Router to be able to have multiple pages and link them properly using React. This is different from using a URL from an A tag, and that's because the way React loads each page, it doesn't actually refresh the page. So you're going to have to use something called React Router as a library. At the same time, we're going to learn how to install a library. So the first thing is to open the terminal, and then we're going to do npm install React Router DOM. So this is going to install the library, and then you're going to want to import link from React Router. Now the thing is, if it's not red, then it has installed properly. But sometimes if you do see red, whether in Codux or in the code editor, you might need to restart those applications and refresh them. So using the link, I'm gonna go to the links in the header. So here we have designs, updates, and buy now. And right now it's using a div. So I'm going to change this tag into a link instead. And the link needs to use the to value, and I'm gonna set it to equal curly braces, quotes, then / browse. And just make sure that you have the closing tag as well. So now we have the link, but we need to route that link properly for the application. Now we're going to set this up in the app.tsx. I'm going to have to import routes and then route from React Router DOM. Using this right now, you can see that it's always going to route to the home page. But when you have multiple pages, you want to make sure that if it hits a certain URL, it's going to include the correct page. So in order to do that, you need to wrap that first inside routes. And then for each route, instead of the component itself, you're going to put that inside a route using path and element. and the element is going to be the home page. And now we need the browse page as well. So let's import the browse page, and it should have the right auto completion for the browse page as well. Keep in mind that app.tsx is what Codux is going to use, and it's going to give you a bunch of errors. So Codux needs an extra step for including the router. And that extra step is to use what we call memory router. So I'm going to have to additionally import memory router from React Router DOM and wrap everything inside memory router. So by doing this, your website should be working fine. Just keep in mind that any time that you're using React Router DOM, including the board, you're going to need to wrap that as well. So for example, you're going to go to the Codux board, and then for the header board, you're going to have to repeat that step. So import memory router from React Router DOM, and then wrap this inside memory router and closing tag. So if you do this, then the component itself is going to work. Furthermore, you're going to have to do the same for the browse page and the home page. So the home page, I'm going to copy this. I'm going to bring this, bring it, and as well as the browse page. So memory router, again, is only for Codux to work and should be included every time that you're using the router in any of the component, which means the footer doesn't need it, the gallery or the gallery item, but the header does need it because it used a link, and the homepage used it because it used the header. And they should only be applied to the boards, not the main component, which means it's only for Codux. For the main React application, I'm going to need to have to separate the two. And there are different ways to go about it. This is one way. And the way I'm going to do it is that app.tsx, I'm going to make this only be used by Codux, and then main.tsx is only going to be used for outside of Codux. So let's import browser as router, routes, and route, and then I'm going to set router, then set the routes. Now I just need to close those tags. Instead of including app, I'm going to include the pages directly. So in this case, I'm going to use home page and then browse page. Make sure they're imported, and I can delete the one that I'm not using. As a result, your application should work both for Codux using the app.tsx, but also for the main application, which is going to use the main.tsx. So if we test this, you're going to see that when I click on design, it's going to change the URL, but also when I refresh that URL, it's going to keep landing on the browse page versus on the home page. If I refresh, it's going to work. Now we do have a few issues with the linking, which we need to replace by using style. We do have a centering issue for the main application, but let's also test on Codux. So if I go to app and I preview, go to the browse page, and you can see it works. I'm also going to open in a new window, and you can see that it's also working perfectly from Codux as well. So that's how you create multiple pages in React. One thing that to keep in mind is that most of this stuff is managed by the templates such as Next.js or Gatsby, or even Create React App. But in this case, we were able to do it from the Codux template, which didn't have a router set up. And so I wanted to show you how to do that from scratch, and I think it's a really good thing to understand. We are at the final section of the course, and we're going to do two essential things for publishing your websites. The first one is to add SEO, title, keywords, description using React Helmet. And the second part is to publish your website on a service like Vercel, where you can host it and the price is really minimal, meaning that it's only $20 per person. However, this is for unlimited amount of websites as long as you fall under their plan. The one that we're going to be using is Netlify. They work pretty much the same way, and Netlify is $19 per month. So you have a certain amount of bandwidth and build minutes and etc. But this is really plenty for most websites, including my own, which is Design Code, and we have hundreds of thousands of visits per month. That's really one of the main advantages of deploying your website using these services is the pricing. So the first thing that we're going to do is to install React Helmet. And so I'm going to open the terminal. And in this case, I'm already using this specific terminal for running. So I'm going to create a new terminal and I'm going to install the React Helmet, also the version for TypeScript. So both of them, and enter. And so once this is installed, you're going to set the SEO for your website. And this should be done on the component of the page, such as homepage. So we're going to import Helmet from React Helmet. Right before the header, we're going to set Helmet. And this is where you can put the equivalent of your title, HTML tags, keywords, and so on. So let me close this Helmet. And then we have the title. I'm going to paste the content. So my homepage is going to have this title, this description using the meta tag for description, and then the meta tag for keywords. So these are for SEO, which is search engine optimizations. I'm going to do the same for the browse page. So going to the browse page.tsx and import Helmet, and then right before the header, I'm going to bring the same. So putting browse first and then dash the title of my site. So if you have done this properly, you're going to see that you have the browse page and then you also have the home page, which has the proper title, description, and keywords. This is essential before publishing your website. We're definitely going to take care of all the styling issues at the end, but for now, let's publish the website to Netlify. And so you're going to have to create an account. And it's pretty straightforward. This is the one that I published the demo for this project, and it's going to generate a URL for you. So to create a new one, you're going to add a new site. You can import an existing project, start from a template, or deploy manually. So drag and drop the build folder. I think the simplest one, especially if you have connected to GitHub, is to import from an existing project. And now you can deploy using GitHub. This has a major advantage, which is that every time that you're committing your changes and you're pushing to GitHub, it's going to automatically build the website without having you doing anything at all. So I'm going to connect to Codux course 2 because the first one is the one that is the real demo of the site. I'm going to set my team, again, 19 per person. If you're solo, it's even cheaper, then you don't need to pay for a large team. And 19 is a really low cost for hosting a full website. So the default settings are pretty good. We have the main branch. It's a simple project, so we don't have many branches. And then you're going to run this specifically, as well as getting the distribution folder and then deploy. If your website is simple, it's going to take a very short amount of time to put it online. And that's it. You can go to deploy and you can see that it was done in 19 seconds and it's live. So you can click on the link of the website. Obviously, you can configure the domain name and it's really straightforward following the instruction. So now when you click on this, it's working perfectly. It's going to take the latest version of your commits to your GitHub. So make sure that the latest changes are pushed. So I'm going to commit this one, which is with the router and Helmet, and I'm going to commit that and make sure to push this to the GitHub repo. When you do that, it's going to automatically deploy the website for you. So every time that you have new changes pushed, it's going to do that without having to do anything. All right, you're going to see that with the new changes, I should see the SEO title when I refresh the page. And voila, it works perfectly. I have the dark mode version. I also have the router working. And we're ready to take care of the final CSS issues. The first glaring issues are that we need to center our page. We need to fix the link color here, which is the default style of CSS. That's fairly easy to do. We're going to go to the homepage CSS And then we're going to add to the app class margin 0 auto. So this is going to center the whole home page within the body. And I'm going to do the same for the browse page as well. So I'm going to go to my local host to see if it works correctly, and that worked great. Let's go to the header to fix the link color. And for this, we have two class names such as button and button1. And so what I can do here is to set the color to var foreground primary. And I'm going to do that for both of these button styles. And also I need to set the text decoration to none. So let me copy this as well. And voila. So this is working perfectly. Another thing that is super necessary is that in the header, I should be able to link this to the home page. I'm going to go to the header, and for the div that says class name logo, I'm going to set that to link and set to just /. So it's going to give me the same issue with the link color and underline. And I can go back to header and go to logo and set text decoration none. So now I can switch back and forth between the home page and the browse page. And one final change before we go is to fix the line at the footer. So I'm going to go to the footer, edit it, select the image, and switch this, change the image, and just select the line.svg. So since this is a Codux course, it's fitting that we should make the final change in Codux. And I really like the fact that it's really not scary to change the images, and it's going to import automatically for you. You can also find the CSS directly. For beginners and for designers who don't want to touch code, you can always edit from the inspector. Yes, it's more manual, but it's what designers know. It's what they're familiar with in Figma. You can use variables and you can select the right element to change, as well as go directly to the code to do more heavy-duty stuff. So that's the power of Codux, and I think a lot of designers are really going to enjoy this. I love the fact that we started from a simple website, a simple component, inserting elements manually and editing the styles in the inspector, all the way to editing everything in CSS, creating new components, learning how to work with boards, importing images, switching to variables and dark mode, and then of course learning how to work like a real developer using VS Code or Z with the help of AI. So I hope you really enjoyed this course, and if you do, please give a comment. Tell us what you think about Codux as well as the techniques that I'm using. Now, before we go, you're not off the hook. You have to do some homework, which means that I want you to apply the grid here. I want you to apply the hover states and maybe even connecting it to a API for submitting data such as Airtable or Notion and even Netlify. I want you to implement the updates page. This is part of the design, and I want you to have fun and really work your way to be a real developer. But most importantly, try the new tools out there such as GitHub Copilot and VS Code, and also give a try to some of these plugins such as Locofy, Dev Mode, and Variables to CSS. We have all of these designs prepared for you for light and dark mode, including the updates page, and all you need to do is to implement it yourself and take it to wherever you want to go. Implement your own design and apply your own styles and animations. So with this, thank you so much for taking the course, and I'll see you in the next one.